Hello again. In this video 102, I will go over the first two parts of question 1 in chapter 21, World War I, sometimes called the Great War, about how this war broke out and the nature of the fighting on the Western Front. Wars are a lot easier to start than to control. The Great War, as it was known until World War II, when it then takes the moniker World War I, resulted from long simmering and extremely complex national rivalries and ethnic conflicts in Central Europe that second-rate statesmen and war-hungry generals allowed to spin out of control. At the core of the tensions was the Austro-Hungarian Empire, an unstable collection of 11 nationalities whose leaders were determined to stop the aggressive expansionism of its neighbor and long-standing enemy, Serbia. The Serbs are Slavs. The Austro-Hungarian Empire was dominated by Germanic peoples. And at the same time, a recklessly militaristic Germany, led by the Kaiser Wilhelm II, was eager to assert its dominance on the European continent against its old enemies, the Russian Empire, who view themselves as being the protector of Slavic culture and peoples, and France, who, if you've seen any world history at all, you know the French and Germans have fought already in the 19th century, which helped lead to the unification of Germany in 1871 at the completion of the Franco-Prussian War, where the first Kaiser was crowned the head of the new German Reich, the Second Empire. And the Germans are also trying to challenge the British Empire's supremacy on the seas in the early 20th century. There's an arms race going on. And this is the immediate cause of the war, the assassination of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand by the Black Hand Gavrilo Princip, who was a nationalist, and he killed both the Archduke and his wife on June 28, 1914. Now, this sets in motion all of the features that had been building throughout the late 19th century in European history. Militarism. Alliance systems were formed between France, Russia, and eventually Britain. Bismarck will engage in the Triple Alliance between the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Germany, and the Ottoman Empire. And out of that, the Central Powers will fight the First World War, and those are the countries involved with being a central power. The Ottoman Empire will collapse completely, finally, after the end of the First World War. And what will bring Britain into the war was the rape of Belgium. It was a neutral country, and the Germans will go across it in order to try to invade France and knock them out of the war quickly. But to back up just a minute, after the Archduke is assassinated, now the Austro-Hungarian Empire views this as a chance to punish the Serbs. And they made a bunch of ultimatums to them, and the Serbs actually gave in to most of the demands, but they didn't care. They were just looking for a fight here, and they declared war on Serbia. Once that happened, the Russians mobilized their armies. Millions of men went to the border of Russia getting ready to fight, which resulted in the Germans issuing an ultimatum to Russia, to the Tsar Nicholas II, to stand down, and the Russians ignored him. So then the Germans declare war on Russia, who is allied with France in the Entente, and then the French declare war. And finally, this brings Britain into the conflict itself. And because they went into neutral Belgium, the Brits had always defended the rights of neutrals until this war breaks out, and then they're going to change their stance, as we'll see in a future video. In the 1880s, when the Triple Alliance was formed, Italy was part of that, but they don't want to get into this battle, and they declare neutrality, and eventually they're actually going to fight on the side of the Allies in return for a promise of territory taken from Austria-Hungary. And here you have the Allied powers, which the United States is going to join after the declaration of war in April of 1917. This is an industrial war, and this goes into the second part of the nature of the fighting on the Western Front. It's the first industrial war, fought between nations using new weapons that dramatically increased the war's scope and destruction. All of these types of weapons, machine guns, submarines, aerial bombing, mustard gas, flamethrowers, landmines, mortars, long-range artillery, and later on armored tanks, which were invented because, as we'll see, this was trench warfare. They're trying to figure out a way to break out of that, and the tank was introduced. And it changed the nature of warfare and produced appalling casualties and widespread destruction. A slaughter on a scale unimaginable to this day. On average, 900 Frenchmen and 1,300 Germans died every day on the Western Front. It was mechanized weaponry that made possible such mass killing. After all, this is mass production now. So we're going to be killing on a mass scale because this is the industrial age. And here you have a nice map of the war and the sides, and everybody is defined by this in 1914. Spain remains neutral, Norway, Sweden, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg, and Switzerland. But pretty much everyone else in Europe is involved in this conflict. And again, this will be the end of the Ottoman Empire at the conclusion of hostilities. If you're looking for a way to remember the long-term causes of the war, the acronym MAIN, M-A-I-N, militarism, the alliance system, the imperialism, which created all these rivalries between nation-states competing in Asia and Africa, and nationalism, again, which was a result of the social Darwinism of the late 19th century. And we've talked about why this is different from other wars. It's mechanized and industrialized, and it was a slaughter. The Europeans killed the old world completely. It will be the beginning of the end of absolute monarchs having any control whatsoever. It's going to be pretty much gone by 1919. And it will lead to ethnic tensions in the United States because there are many hyphenated Americans. First generation, even into the second generation Americans will still have a lot of loyalties to the old country. The Irish hate the British because they have ruled Ireland for centuries, and there's going to be the troubles in the 20s right after the conclusion of the Great War. And eventually there's going to be self-rule for the Republic of Ireland, but Northern Ireland is going to have to remain part of the British Empire. German Americans, as we'll see in this conflict, are heavily discriminated against in the United States. My old high school in Tonawanda, New York, stopped teaching German in 1917. Sauerkraut will become Liberty cabbage. Dachshunds will be called Liberty pups. And they will try to go to these links to try to eliminate any sort of German influence from American society. If there is a symbol and a way to remember the nature of the warfare in the Great War, it was trench warfare. It's prolonged combat between entrenched positions of opposing armies with little tactical movement. Again, there was quick movement at the beginning because the Germans want to knock the French out. We're going to see that again in World War II. But after that, the war bogs down. And they started building a series of zigzagging trenches all through this part of Europe. Northeast France, up to the borders of Switzerland, which remains neutral. This is all going to be all trenches and fortifications that are swarming with rats, underwater at times from the rain, for 450 miles across northeastern France. And that's going to have a heavy impact on agriculture. Not too much food is going to be grown for a couple of years. And by 1917, people are starving in Europe because all of the food is being imported mainly from the United States. And when all is said and done, grumbled an English infantry officer, the war was mainly a matter of holes in ditches. Here you have a nice picture of a German trench with their machine guns getting ready to slaughter anybody that comes up to try to engage them. A wounded soldier in the background, and behind the trenches will be the artillery fortifications, which will attempt to soften up all of those regions before these guys go over the top and try to take land. They ate, slept, lived, and died without leaving their crowded underground homes. And after the war, the French will take this to extremes with the Maginot Line, where they'll try to improve the conditions in the trench. And then Hitler and the Germans in the beginning of the Second World War won't even engage the Maginot Line. They'll strictly go around it with their tanks. They wasted millions of francs with these elaborate underground fortifications. And that's the problem with warfare a lot of times. They're always fighting the last war, not the one that is actually going on at the time. It's a physical, almost animal existence in which the primitive instincts of the race have full sway. Eating, drinking, sleeping, fighting, everything but loving. And from those years, the opposing armies in northeast France attacked and counterattacked, hardly gaining any ground one way or the other. And the casualties were in the millions. As I mentioned, the Europeans slaughtered each other, and they destroyed the world they had created in the 19th century. Time and again, inept generals sent masses of mud-streaked, steel-helmeted soldiers over the top, and they had to slog across no man's land between opposing entrenchments, running into barbed wire and machine guns and high-powered rifles, overlaid by constant artillery shelling, which led to thousands getting post-traumatic stress disorder, or at the time, shell shock. They would become quite unconscious, with violent shivering and shaking. Victims of shell shock were often hysterical and could neither eat nor sleep. Its horrific butchery seemed especially pointless, since neither side was capable of gaining the advantage. And a British Army chaplain described the war as a senseless waste of muscle, waste of brain, waste of patience, waste of pain, glory, and a waste of God. In part 2, I will go over then how the United States will become involved in the Great War.